The strangest thing about that morning wasn't the sheriff's SUV parked outside my ranch gate. It wasn't the county inspector kneeling beside my fence with a clipboard, or the crowd of angry HOA neighbors pointing fingers like they had already decided I was guilty. It was the silence. The clothesline that had been stretched across my cedar fence for months was finally empty, and for the first time in nearly a year, all I could hear was the wind pushing through the live oaks and the distant sound of my cattle moving across the pasture. Everyone believed I had turned my ranch fence into a trap. They couldn't have been more wrong. My name is Cole Harrison, and everything you're about to hear started with something so ridiculous that no one would have believed it if I hadn't recorded every single minute. My family has owned this ranch just outside Burnett, Texas, since 1979. My grandfather built that cedar fence himself with weathered hands, a borrowed post auger, and enough determination to make every fence post stand perfectly straight for generations. Growing up, I learned that a fence wasn't just wood and wire. It was a promise. On one side, you respected another person's property. On the other, you expected the same respect in return. That lesson stayed with me long after my grandfather passed away. Every spring, I replaced broken boards. Every fall, I tightened the wire before winter storms rolled in. I knew every knot, every nail, every crooked cedar post that had settled an inch over 40 years. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. When the Willow Creek Ridge HOA expanded next to my ranch 2 years ago, I figured we'd coexist just fine. Their manicured lawns stopped exactly where my pasture began. Their sidewalks ended where my gravel road continued. Different worlds sharing the same Texas sky. At least, that's what I thought. Then Brenda Whitmore became HOA president. You could spot Brenda from half a mile away. White luxury SUV polished so brightly it reflected the afternoon sun like a mirror. Designer outfits in colors louder than a 4th of July fireworks show. Oversized sunglasses. Jewelry that jingled before she even spoke. And behind that permanent smile lived the kind of confidence that only came from believing every rule existed for someone else. She treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom and everyone inside it like unpaid employees. One Saturday morning, while fixing a loose hinge on my barn, I caught the sweet smell of lavender fabric softener drifting across the pasture. It made no sense until I looked toward the fence. 3 complete bedsheet sets hung across my cedar rails, clipped neatly with colorful plastic clothespins. At first, I honestly thought someone had made a mistake. Maybe the wind had carried them there. Maybe somebody was chasing a runaway blanket. Then I saw Brenda standing on the HOA side, sipping coffee and chatting with 2 neighbors while admiring laundry hanging from my fence like it belonged in a department store display. I walked over calmly and said, "Morning. That's my fence." Brenda barely looked up. She smiled like I had interrupted her brunch reservation. "It's just a fence," she said. "The sunshine hits this side better." I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. By the following weekend, there were towels, then comforters, then kids' soccer uniforms. Someone even tied clothesline rope directly around one of my fence posts without asking. Every Saturday looked like a giant outdoor laundry festival creeping farther down my property line. My cattle avoided that section because colorful sheets kept flapping in the wind. Birds nested inside forgotten blankets. Clothespins littered my pasture after storms. When I politely asked people to stop, they shrugged and pointed toward Brenda. She said it was community space. Community space. Those 2 words echoed in my head every time I drove the ranch road. It didn't matter that the survey markers sat 3 feet inside my property. It didn't matter that bright private property signs faced the subdivision every 100 yards. Somehow, Brenda had convinced dozens of people that if they ignored the property line long enough, it would eventually disappear. I wasn't angry yet. Mostly, I was confused. Confused that grown adults could mistake someone else's ranch for a neighborhood convenience. Confused that common courtesy had become optional. But confusion slowly turned into concern when I noticed fresh nail holes drilled into my cedar posts, wire stretched tighter than it should have been, and one of my grandfather's original rails beginning to split under the weight of soaking wet quilts after a summer rain. That's when I stopped arguing. That's when I started documenting. And without realizing it, Brenda Whitmore had already begun building the strongest case I would ever need. The following Monday, I woke before sunrise like I always did. Ranch life does not care about weekends, holidays, or whether your neighbors have decided to invent new ways to make your life complicated. The smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen while the old ceiling fan hummed above me. By 5:30, I was already outside feeding cattle, checking water troughs, and listening to boots crunch across limestone gravel that my grandfather spread decades earlier. Those quiet mornings were the reason I stayed. Some people chase bigger houses or faster cities. I stayed because I could still watch the first rays of sunlight roll across open pasture without another roof blocking the horizon. My grandfather used to tell me that land remembers how you treat it. If you respected it, it would take care of you. Every fence repair, every cedar sapling, every patch of restored grass was my way of keeping that promise alive. That was why seeing strangers treat my property like an extension of their backyard felt so personal. It was never about laundry. It was about respect disappearing one small decision at a time. The strange part was that most of the people hanging clothes on my fence were not bad people. They smiled when they walked their dogs. They waved during neighborhood garage sales. A retired school teacher lived 2 houses down from Brenda and always baked peach cobbler for church fundraisers. A young couple had twin boys who loved watching my horses from across the fence. On their own, most of them probably would have asked permission. But somewhere along the way, Brenda convinced everyone that asking was unnecessary. Every conversation somehow ended with the same sentence. Brenda said it was fine. Those 5 words became a permission slip for behavior that never should have happened. One afternoon, I found 3 expensive beach towels hanging across the newest section of cedar fencing I had finished rebuilding only 2 weeks earlier. Tiny metal clips had already scratched the fresh wood. I carefully removed every towel, folded them neatly, and carried them to the sidewalk where several neighbors were chatting. I smiled and handed them back without raising my voice. I simply said, "Please do not hang anything on my fence anymore. It damages the wood." One woman looked genuinely embarrassed. She apologized immediately. Before she could finish, Brenda stepped between us wearing a bright floral jacket that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill. Her oversized sunglasses reflected the afternoon sun as she folded her arms and laughed softly. "Cole, you are acting like we are tearing the place down. It is just temporary." I looked directly at her and answered, "Temporary damage is still damage." Her smile tightened for a second before returning. "Community living requires compromise." That sentence stayed with me the entire drive back to the barn. Community living. The interesting thing was that my ranch was never part of the homeowners association. My property existed long before their subdivision appeared on county maps. I paid county taxes, maintained my own roads, repaired my own fencing, and answered to county regulations instead of neighborhood committees. Yet somehow Brenda spoke as if the rules inside her subdivision extended beyond its entrance signs and decorative stone walls. A few days later, I pulled the original property survey from the filing cabinet in my office. The paper smelled faintly of dust and old ink after years inside a weatherproof folder. Bright red boundary lines clearly marked every corner of my ranch. The cedar fence stood entirely inside my property by nearly 30 inches. There was no shared easement. No common maintenance agreement. No public access corridor. It was as private as my front porch. I drove to the county records office anyway because I wanted absolute certainty before saying another word. The clerk recognized my family name almost immediately. She printed updated parcel maps and confirmed exactly what I already believed. Nothing had changed. The fence belonged entirely to me. Walking back to my truck with those documents tucked under my arm, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because I had discovered new information, but because facts do not change just because someone speaks louder than everyone else. That afternoon, I installed 2 brand new reflective private property signs along the fence where everyone could easily see them. I even replaced faded survey stakes with bright orange markers recommended by the county surveyor. I honestly believed that would end everything. Instead, when Saturday arrived again, I found fresh bed sheets hanging directly beneath one of the new signs. Almost as if someone wanted to prove the sign meant nothing at all. Standing there beneath the Texas sun, listening to clothespins clicking gently against cedar boards in the breeze, I realized this was no longer a misunderstanding. Someone had quietly turned ignoring my property rights into a neighborhood tradition. By the middle of October, I realized I was no longer dealing with a simple disagreement between neighbors. I was dealing with a story that Brenda had carefully repeated until people accepted it without ever checking whether it was true. Ranch life teaches you to pay attention to patterns, and her pattern became impossible to ignore. Every conversation sounded rehearsed. Every explanation used the same words. Every new neighbor who wandered over to my fence repeated some version of, "Brenda said everyone uses this side." One cool Thursday evening, while the smell of mesquite smoke drifted from backyard barbecue grills inside the subdivision, my longtime neighbor Frank Miller pulled into my gravel driveway in his old pickup. Frank had lived beside my family long before the subdivision replaced open pasture with identical rooftops. He climbed out holding a folded paper plate wrapped in aluminum foil. His wife had baked pecan pie, but judging by the look on his face, dessert was not the real reason he had stopped by. We sat on the porch while the last sunlight painted the cedar fence a warm golden brown. Frank cleared his throat before speaking. "You should probably know what happened at the homeowners association meeting last night." I leaned back without saying a word. Frank explained that Brenda had stood at the front of the clubhouse with a large neighborhood map displayed on an easel. According to him, she called my property line a shared community edge and described my fence as an underused resource that could benefit everyone. She apparently joked that ranch owners always had more space than they needed anyway. Several homeowners questioned whether she had spoken with me first. Frank said she smiled confidently and answered that the arrangement had become an accepted neighborhood tradition. Tradition. I almost laughed hearing that word. The subdivision itself had not existed long enough to create the tradition she described. Frank admitted that some people looked uncomfortable, but nobody wanted to challenge the president of the association in front of the entire room. Before leaving, he looked directly at me and quietly said, "Most folks are following her because they think she already checked everything." After his truck disappeared down the gravel road, I walked alone toward the fence. The evening air carried the scent of cedar, fresh hay, and distant rain that never quite reached our county. My boots stopped beside one of the oldest fence posts my grandfather had set by hand more than 4 decades earlier. Running my fingers across the weathered wood, I noticed several fresh scratches where nylon rope had rubbed against the grain. Tiny marks by themselves meant very little, but together they told the entire story. Every week someone pushed the boundary a little farther because nobody had ever shown them where the line truly belonged. The following Saturday proved exactly how much confidence Brenda had built. Families arrived carrying folding laundry baskets before breakfast. Bright quilts, towels, and bed sheets covered nearly every section of cedar facing the subdivision. Someone had even attached removable plastic hooks around one rail to make hanging heavier blankets easier. Another homeowner leaned a lightweight aluminum drying rack directly against my fence. Nobody asked permission. Nobody even looked toward the ranch house. They behaved as though the property had quietly become part of the neighborhood park. I spent nearly an hour removing everything with the same patience I used repairing damaged fence boards. I folded every blanket neatly, stacked every towel carefully, and placed everything beside the public sidewalk where the owners could retrieve it without stepping onto my land again. A few neighbors thanked me politely. Others looked confused. Then Brenda arrived in her polished white sport utility vehicle wearing another bright designer outfit that seemed determined to compete with the Texas sunrise. She stepped out smiling as though she had been invited to a celebration instead of another disagreement. "Cole," she called cheerfully, "you really do not have to make this into such a big issue." I looked around at the fence, the survey stakes, the private property signs, and the fresh scrape marks left by another week of careless use. Then I answered as calmly as I could. "The issue is not the laundry. The issue is that nobody here seems to remember where my property ends and theirs begins." Her smile faded for only a heartbeat before returning stronger than ever. Sometimes being a good neighbor means sharing. I nodded slowly because at that exact moment something became perfectly clear. Sharing only exists when both people agree. What Brenda wanted was not cooperation. She wanted permission she had never been given, and she was counting on repetition to make everyone forget the difference. The weeks that followed felt less like a neighborhood dispute and more like watching someone slowly redraw a property line with pure confidence instead of facts. Every few days there was something new. One morning, I found heavy comforters hanging from ropes tied tightly around my cedar posts. The damp weight had pulled one section of fencing nearly an inch out of alignment. Another afternoon, someone leaned two large drying racks directly against the rails, scratching away the protective finish I had brushed on only a month earlier. Bright plastic clothespins littered the grass after every windy afternoon, and I spent more time picking them out of my pasture than I cared to admit, because the last thing I wanted was curious livestock chewing on broken plastic. Then came the children. They were not trying to cause trouble. They simply copied what the adults around them accepted as normal. While parents chatted beside the fence waiting for laundry to dry, the kids wandered closer to my side of the property. Soccer balls rolled beneath the bottom rail. Toy trucks appeared in the grass. One little boy reached through the wire trying to pet one of my calves, while his mother barely looked up from her conversation. I walked over, smiled, and gently explained that cattle were calm until they were startled, and that everyone would be safer staying behind the fence. She thanked me politely, but before she could gather her son, Brenda's voice floated across the breeze. They are perfectly fine where they are. It amazed me how quickly she dismissed concerns about property and safety whenever the inconvenience belonged to someone else. The following Saturday, I noticed something that finally pushed the situation beyond simple frustration. Someone had drilled two shiny metal screw hooks directly into one of my grandfather's original cedar rails. They were spaced perfectly for hanging blankets. I stood there for several seconds without moving, staring at fresh wood shavings scattered across the ground. The smell of newly exposed cedar filled the cool morning air. I carefully removed both hooks with a screwdriver from my truck, photographed the damage from every angle, measured the location, and sealed the holes before moisture could work its way inside the wood. While I was finishing the repair, Brenda walked over carrying her usual clipboard. She glanced at the rail and sighed dramatically. Now nobody can use those hooks. I looked up and asked, "Who installed them?" She shrugged without answering. People were just making things more convenient. I tightened the last screw on the repaired board before standing. Convenient for who? She smiled the way she always did whenever she believed she had already won the conversation. For the community. That answer told me everything I needed to know. Convenience had become more important than permission. The next surprise arrived 3 days later in my mailbox. Inside was an official-looking letter printed on Homeowners Association stationery. According to the notice, my fence had become an unattractive visual barrier that interfered with neighborhood harmony. The association encouraged me to repaint or replace it using colors that better matched the subdivision's aesthetic guidelines. I actually laughed out loud standing beside my mailbox. My ranch had never belonged to the Homeowners Association. Their rules stopped at their entrance sign. Yet somehow they had found the confidence to critique fencing that had stood on private agricultural land since long before their first foundation was poured. Instead of throwing the letter away, I slipped it into the growing binder inside my office. Every photograph, every conversation, every written notice, every repair receipt now sat in perfect chronological order. The binder grew thicker each week, while Brenda grew bolder. She believed persistence would eventually wear me down. What she did not realize was that every unnecessary letter, every damaged fence board, every unauthorized improvement, and every confident claim she made without evidence quietly strengthened something far more powerful than an argument. They were creating a timeline that no opinion could rewrite, and for the first time since this whole ridiculous situation began, I stopped wondering how to change Brenda's mind. I started thinking about how to make the truth speak for itself. After that letter arrived, something changed inside me. I stopped reacting to every comment, every sarcastic smile, and every new piece of laundry that appeared along the fence. Brenda seemed to mistake my silence for surrender. In reality, I had simply decided that my energy was better spent collecting facts than winning arguments. Every evening after finishing chores around the ranch, I carried a legal pad, a measuring tape, and my camera down the property line. The fading sunlight painted long shadows across the pasture, while the smell of fresh cedar mixed with dry autumn grass. I documented everything with the same patience my grandfather once used to repair fences one board at a time. Every scratch received a photograph. Every loose staple was measured. Every repair was logged with the date, the cost of materials, and the number of hours required to restore the fence to its original condition. Before long, my office desk looked less like a ranch office and more like a surveyor's workspace. Receipts sat beside printed photographs. County maps rested next to maintenance records. Security camera timestamps lined up perfectly with handwritten notes describing what had happened each day. One Tuesday morning, I drove into Burnett to meet with the county surveyor who had updated my property map a few weeks earlier. He recognized the address immediately and smiled when he saw the folder tucked under my arm. We spread the survey across his desk, and he traced the boundary line with his finger. The cedar fence stood exactly where it had for decades, well inside my property. There was no shared easement, no public access agreement, and no recorded document giving anyone outside my ranch permission to use it. Before leaving, I purchased certified copies of the survey along with updated parcel records because I wanted every document to come directly from the county instead of relying on old family files. From there, I stopped by the Agricultural Extension Office. I explained that I was maintaining livestock fencing beside a growing residential subdivision and wanted to be certain every future repair followed current recommendations. The specialist spent nearly half an hour discussing fence maintenance, livestock safety, proper warning signage, and routine inspection practices. I listened carefully and took notes. By the time I walked back to my truck, I realized something important. Good ranch management was not only about protecting animals. It was also about protecting people who might wander too close without understanding where private property began. Meanwhile, Brenda appeared more confident than ever. According to several neighbors, she proudly told people that I had finally accepted the arrangement because I was no longer walking over to complain every weekend. That rumor worked exactly the way she hoped. More families began using the fence. Larger blankets appeared. Someone even started bringing a folding chair so they could sit comfortably while waiting for laundry to dry. Every additional visit simply created another clear record on my cameras. I no longer interrupted anyone. I watched from a distance, made notes, and returned to work around the ranch. One crisp Saturday morning, while frost still clung to patches of grass beneath the cedar trees, I noticed Brenda stopping beside one of my newest private property signs. She stood there for several seconds talking with another homeowner before both of them laughed and continued walking along the fence. Later that afternoon, I checked the area and discovered the sign had been twisted sideways, making it almost impossible to read from the subdivision. I straightened it, tightened the mounting screws, photographed its condition, and added another entry to my growing binder. Every small detail fit neatly into the timeline. Every photograph answered another question before anyone had the chance to ask it. Standing there beside the fence as the evening breeze rustled through the pasture, I finally understood that this situation would never be resolved by louder voices or sharper arguments. It would be resolved by preparation, documentation, and patience. Brenda believed confidence created authority. I believed evidence created truth, and with every passing day, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. By early November, I finally had everything I needed except one thing: patience measured in one more weekend. The binder on my office desk had grown thick enough that it barely closed. Every page told the same story from a different angle. County survey maps confirmed the property line. Repair receipts showed months of unnecessary damage. Security camera footage documented repeated trespassing without a single confrontation from me. Certified parcel records proved the fence belonged entirely to my ranch. The more organized everything became, the calmer I felt. It was almost disappointing how ordinary the truth looked once every piece was placed in order. One cool Monday morning, I drove back to the agricultural supply store where I had been buying fencing materials for years. The familiar smell of cedar posts, galvanized wire, and fresh-cut lumber greeted me the moment I stepped inside. I spoke with the manager about upgrading one section of fencing along the pasture where my younger cattle occasionally grazed during winter rotation. We discussed modern livestock fencing, routine maintenance, inspection schedules, and the importance of visible warning signs anywhere an electrified livestock fence operated. Nothing about the conversation was unusual. Ranchers throughout Texas use properly installed electric livestock fencing every day to safely contain animals. Before ordering a single component, I confirmed every recommendation with the Agricultural Extension Office I had visited the previous week. I wanted everything installed exactly the way current guidance recommended. During the next several days, I worked steadily along the property line. The original cedar fence remained exactly where my grandfather had built it. Just inside my side of the property, separated from the public side and intended solely for livestock management, I added a properly installed electric livestock wire as part of the ranch enclosure. Every connection was checked twice. Every grounding rod was tested. Every insulator sat exactly where it belonged. Most importantly, bright warning signs were mounted at regular intervals along the fence line where anyone approaching from the subdivision could clearly see them. Large yellow lettering identified the fence as an electric livestock fence. They were impossible to miss. Once everything was complete, I photographed every sign from multiple angles, recording the date and time with the same attention I had given every other piece of documentation. Then I did something Brenda never expected. I mailed a courteous written notice directly to the Homeowners Association office informing them that livestock fencing improvements had been completed entirely on private ranch property and reminding residents to remain outside the clearly marked boundary. I also kept proof that the notice had been delivered. That evening I sat on my porch listening to the steady chirping of crickets while the last orange light disappeared behind the hills. For the first time in months, I felt no frustration at all. There was nothing left to argue about because everything that mattered had already been documented. The following Saturday arrived bright and cool. I finished feeding cattle before sunrise and noticed several cars beginning to gather along the subdivision street, as they usually did on weekends. Instead of walking toward the fence, I continued my morning chores. Through the distance, I could see colorful laundry baskets appearing one by one. A few people slowed as they reached the new warning signs. Some pointed toward them. Others seemed uncertain. Several neighbors quietly turned around and carried their laundry back home without saying a word. That alone made all the effort worthwhile. Clear information often solved problems better than raised voices ever could. Brenda, however, arrived nearly an hour later in her familiar white sport utility vehicle. Even from across the pasture, her confident stride looked exactly the same as always. She gathered several homeowners around one of the warning signs while gesturing toward the fence as though delivering another one of her neighborhood speeches. I could not hear the conversation from where I stood, but I noticed several people glance back toward the signs with uncertain expressions before looking at Brenda again. Whatever she told them seemed to erase their hesitation because the group slowly moved closer to the fence once more. I simply watched from a distance, making another quiet note in the small notebook I carried every morning. Months earlier, I would have walked over hoping another conversation might finally settle the matter. Now I understood that conversations were never the real solution. Facts were. The cameras continued recording. The signs remained clearly visible. The county records had not changed. Neither had the property line. Standing beside the pasture as a cool breeze carried the scent of cedar and dry grass across the ranch, I realized that every decision from this point forward belonged entirely to the people reading the warnings in front of them, and that simple truth was stronger than any argument Brenda could ever invent. Saturday mornings had become so predictable that I could almost tell the time without looking at my watch. The first cars arrived just after 8. The smell of fresh laundry detergent drifted across the pasture before I ever saw anyone carrying baskets toward the fence. This time, though, something felt different. People slowed down as they approached the bright yellow warning signs. Several homeowners stopped to read them. One older gentleman adjusted his glasses and pointed toward the notice before quietly carrying his blankets back to his car. A young couple exchanged a few words, looked toward my ranch, and decided to leave as well. For a brief moment, I thought common sense had finally won. Then Brenda arrived. Her white sport utility vehicle rolled to the curb exactly where it always did. She stepped out wearing another brightly colored designer outfit, holding her familiar clipboard as though she were arriving to inspect a construction project instead of someone else's property. Even from across the pasture, I could see her waving dismissively toward the warning signs. She gathered several homeowners into a small circle and spoke with complete confidence. I could not hear every word from where I stood, but I did not need to. Their body language changed almost immediately. The hesitation disappeared. One by one, people began unfolding blankets again. A few looked uncertain, glancing back at the signs before continuing anyway. I stayed exactly where I was beside the cattle pen. There was nothing left for me to explain. Every sign was clearly visible. Every notice had been delivered. Every improvement had been documented. The cameras mounted along the ranch recorded everything from multiple angles without missing a second. A few minutes later, I noticed something that made me set my feed bucket down. Brenda walked directly toward one of the warning signs. She looked around briefly, reached up with both hands, and turned the sign until it faced away from the subdivision. Another homeowner watched, but said nothing. Brenda smiled, dusted off her hands, and continued talking as though she had simply straightened a picture frame. My cameras captured the entire sequence. That single decision changed the story far more than anything I could have said. Several families resumed using the fence line after the sign had been turned. Others appeared confused by the mixed messages and stepped back onto the sidewalk instead. Within minutes, someone called the non-emergency sheriff's office to report confusion about the fence and whether it complied with county requirements. I welcomed the call because independent verification was exactly what I had hoped for from the beginning. Less than an hour later, a deputy arrived along with a county agricultural inspector who happened to be working nearby that morning. They parked outside my ranch gate and walked the entire fence line while I met them with my documentation binder already in hand. The inspector examined the installation carefully. He checked the spacing of the warning signs, inspected the placement of the livestock wire inside the ranch boundary, reviewed the grounding system, and compared everything against the property survey I provided. The deputy watched quietly while taking notes. After nearly 40 minutes, the inspector closed his clipboard and nodded. He explained that the livestock fence had been installed on private property, the warning notices were appropriate, and the improvements appeared consistent with normal agricultural use. Then he paused and pointed toward one of the signs that now faced sideways instead of toward approaching pedestrians. He asked whether I had turned it. I answered honestly, "No, sir. My cameras recorded someone else moving it this morning." The deputy requested to view the footage. We watched the recording together inside my ranch office. The video clearly showed the sign facing the correct direction when the morning began. It also clearly showed Brenda rotating it away from approaching residents before encouraging people to continue using the fence line. Nobody in the room raised their voice. Nobody argued. The silence after the recording ended said more than any speech ever could. Outside, the breeze continued moving through the cedar trees while folded blankets slowly disappeared from the fence line one by one. For the first time since this strange dispute began, the conversation no longer centered on my ranch. It centered on choices that had been recorded, documented, and confirmed by facts that did not depend on anyone's opinion. The following week, the atmosphere around Willow Creek Ridge felt completely different. Nobody parked beside my fence before breakfast anymore. The colorful blankets, oversized comforters, and plastic baskets that had become such a familiar sight simply never appeared. Word traveled quickly through the subdivision after the deputy and the agricultural inspector completed their reports. They had not found some dangerous trap hidden on my ranch. They had found a properly maintained livestock fence on private property, clear warning signs, and months of documented efforts by the property owner to prevent unnecessary conflicts. More importantly, they had confirmed that the warning sign had been turned away after it had already been installed correctly. That small detail changed every conversation. Suddenly, neighbors who had confidently repeated Brenda's version of events began asking questions of their own. Several people stopped by my gate over the next few days. They did not come to argue. They came to apologize. The retired school teacher brought a loaf of homemade banana bread and admitted she had never realized the fence sat entirely inside my property line. The young couple with the twin boys apologized for allowing their children too close to the pasture and thanked me for always speaking calmly instead of losing my temper. One man quietly handed me a small envelope containing cash to help replace one of the cedar rails that had been damaged months earlier. I thanked him, but I told him that respecting the property line going forward meant far more to me than paying for a single board. The ranch had survived storms, droughts, and decades of hard work. It could certainly survive a few scratched fence posts. Respect, however, was much harder to rebuild once people stopped recognizing it. A few evenings later, the Homeowners Association held another meeting inside the neighborhood clubhouse. I was not a member, so I did not attend, but several residents later described what happened. This time, the questions did not come from Brenda. They came from the homeowners themselves. They wanted to know why official county records had never been reviewed before the fence was described as community space. They asked why written notices from a neighboring property owner had been ignored. They asked why a warning sign had been turned away after residents had already begun reading it. For the first time since the subdivision was built, Brenda reportedly had no confident answer ready. Confidence is easy when nobody asks for proof. It becomes much harder when every statement can be compared against photographs, surveys, certified records, and video footage. Within 2 weeks, the association announced that a special election would be held for board leadership. I had no interest in neighborhood politics, but I could not help noticing that Brenda's white sport utility vehicle no longer made its daily patrols along the subdivision streets. Another board member eventually visited my ranch to apologize on behalf of the association. He explained that the board intended to remind residents that homeowners association authority ended at the subdivision boundary and that neighboring private property deserved the same respect as any other privately owned land. He also asked whether I would allow a licensed contractor hired by the association to replace the damaged cedar rails and restore the sections that had been scratched or altered without permission. I agreed on one condition. The replacement lumber had to match the original cedar as closely as possible because preserving my grandfather's work mattered more than making everything look brand new. A few weeks later, the repairs were complete. Fresh cedar blended almost perfectly with the older weathered boards. The survey markers stood straight again. Every private property sign remained exactly where it belonged, facing anyone approaching from the subdivision. The electric livestock fence continued doing the quiet job it had always been intended to do, helping manage cattle safely while remaining clearly marked for anyone nearby. Standing beside the fence one cool evening as the last sunlight settled across the pasture, I realized something I had almost forgotten during those long months of frustration. I had never really been fighting over laundry. I had been defending a simple idea my grandfather taught me long ago. Property lines are not just marks on a survey. They are promises between neighbors. Respect them, and communities grow stronger. Ignore them, and eventually the truth has a way of reminding everyone exactly where they have always been. Winter settled over the ranch one quiet morning without making much of an announcement. The first lights spread slowly across the pasture, turning the frost on the grass into thousands of tiny crystals that shimmered like scattered glass. My boots crunched across the familiar gravel road while the smell of cedar and fresh coffee drifted through the cold air. The fence stood exactly where it always had, stretching across the property with the same quiet confidence my grandfather had built into every post more than 40 years ago. The difference was not the fence. The difference was everything around it. No colorful blankets hung from the rails. No plastic clothespins rattled against the cedar whenever the wind picked up. No folding chairs lined the property line. Instead, the only sounds were cattle grazing peacefully, meadowlarks calling from the oak trees, and the gentle hum of ranch life returning to the rhythm it had always known. Every once in a while, neighbors walking along the subdivision sidewalk would wave as they passed. Some stopped for a short conversation about the weather or asked how the cattle were doing. The retired school teacher still baked her famous banana bread every holiday season. The young couple with the twin boys now pointed toward the survey markers whenever their children wandered too close, quietly teaching them something that many adults had almost forgotten. Respect starts with recognizing where someone else's space begins. Even the homeowners association eventually installed a small notice near the neighborhood entrance reminding residents to respect adjacent private property. I smiled the first time I drove past it because those few simple words would have prevented months of unnecessary conflict if they had been there from the beginning. People sometimes ask whether I feel satisfied that everything worked out the way it did. The honest answer is yes, but probably not for the reason most people expect. I never wanted anyone to be embarrassed. I never wanted neighbors to argue with one another. I never wanted meetings, reports, or investigations. All I ever wanted was for one simple sentence to mean exactly what it said. Private property. That was never about keeping good people out. It was about protecting the work, memories, and responsibility that came with caring for land passed down through generations. My grandfather used to say that the strongest fences were never built to separate good neighbors. They were built so good neighbors would always know where respect began. I understand those words much better now than I did when I was a kid carrying fence posts across this pasture beside him. Looking back, I also learned something about patience. There were dozens of moments when I could have responded with anger. There were countless opportunities to raise my voice or turn every disagreement into another argument. None of those choices would have solved the real problem. Quiet preparation did. Accurate records did. Calm conversations did. Facts outlast opinions every single time. The cameras eventually stopped recording anything interesting because there was nothing left to record. The binder that once grew thicker every week now sits on a shelf in my office collecting dust beside old ranch journals and weather records. I hope I never have to open it again. Its job was never to win an argument. Its job was simply to preserve the truth until the truth had a chance to speak for itself. Every evening, as the sun settles behind the Texas hills, I still walk the same stretch of fence before heading back to the house. My hand still brushes across the weathered cedar posts exactly the way it did before any of this happened. The scratches have been repaired. The damaged rails have been replaced. The promise my grandfather built into that fence remains exactly the same. Justice was never loud. It never needed to be. Sometimes justice is nothing more than a quiet sunrise, a respected property line, and neighbors who finally understand that kindness and boundaries can exist together. I would really like to know what you think after hearing this story. If you had been in my place, would you have handled it the same way, or would you have chosen a different path? Share your thoughts in the comments because I always enjoy reading how people see these situations from different perspectives. And if stories about standing up for what is right through patience, common sense, and lawful solutions are the kind of stories you enjoy, I hope you will consider subscribing so we can share many more journeys like this together. As for me, tomorrow morning the coffee will still be hot, the cattle will still need feeding, and the old cedar fence will still be standing exactly where it belongs.